Hello friends, in the series which we are doing on the making of contemporary India 1950 to 1990s, we'll talk about the JP movement. Initially, in the first lecture on the JP movement, we talked about the kind of issues which were happening before the starting of the JP movement, the kind of developments which were happening in Gujarat and Bihar, and how they influenced the course of the Indian politics in the entire country as well. So we talked about those kinds of aspects where how the issues of elections they were interlinked, and the various kinds of judgments which came with regard to the election of Indira Gandhi. And we find that during this particular period we also see that how Indira Gandhi suffered some kind of a political blow when she lost elections to the Gujarat Assembly election, which came on 13th June, and how Janata Front it succeeded in forming a government in alliance with the same Chiman Bhai Patel, against whose corruption and maladministration popular movement had been initiated. So these were the kind of developments which were happening, and how the Allahabad judgment and the Gujarat Assembly results they revived the opposition movement, which was in a way becoming weaker at that point of time. And we also see that how JP and a coalition of the opposition parties they were not willing to wait for the result of Indira Gandhi's appeal to the Supreme Court or the general elections to Lok Sabha, which were due in 8 months. So this kind of a situation where there was a lot of confusion and frenzy was created, and they decided that they had to seize the opportunity, and they were accusing Mrs. Gandhi that how she was clinging to an office in which had been corruptly gained by her, and they demanded the resignation, and they called for a countrywide campaign to force this issue. And in a rally in Delhi on 25th June, they announced that a nationwide 1-week campaign of mass mobilization and civil disobedience to force Mrs. Gandhi to resign would be initiated on 29 June. So that was the kind of a situation which was unfolding at that point of time, and they also suggested that how the campaign it would end with the gherao of Prime Minister's house by hundreds of volunteers. And JP asked people to make it impossible for the government to function, and to see that once again he in a way appealed to the armed forces, police and bureaucracy to refuse to obey any orders they regarded as illegal and unconstitutional. So we find that such kind of appeals they were being made by JP, that the various organs of the government they should not support the government in any way, and they should make it clear that whatever orders which are being given by the government which are unconstitutional in nature, which are illegal in nature, they are not being in any way obeyed by the bureaucracy. And we find that such kind of developments during this period, how Indira Gandhi reacted in fashion which was some sort of a lightning response, and a state of internal emergency was declared on the morning of 26 June 1975. And when we find that how when we tend to understand the JP movement and the way it was talking about total revolution or Sampurna Kranti, and how it wanted to root out the kind of corruption which was happening in the Indian life and politics, and it was regarded by JP that this kind of a corruption was because of Mrs. Gandhi and the Congress party, and they had to defend the democracy in whichever way which was possible. And they were also fighting the authoritarian personality of Mrs. Indira Gandhi, and the way she was trying to handle the politics and administration, so which was not in any way admissible or acceptable to JP. And JP came from the political wilderness. He was not active in the initial period, and now when he came to the political scene, he got a lot of support from different political parties, and their main agenda was anti-Congressism in that context. And JP felt that how Indira Gandhi was trying to destroy all democratic institutions, and she was trying to establish a Soviet-backed dictatorship in her hunger for power. And her continuation in the office, he said, was incompatible with the survival of democracy in India. And many critics and opponents of Indira Gandhi, they felt the way JP felt, and they supported the kind of ideas which JP had, and he felt that this kind of authoritarianism was a challenge to the Indian democracy, and Indian democracy will be wiped out if this kind of authoritarianism will flourish. So he wanted that this kind of authoritarianism should go away, and that is why he was ready to fight and ready to, in a way, seek the support of other opposition political parties against Indira Gandhi. And when we tend to see the kind of actions which were taken by Indira Gandhi, she was trying to justify her own actions in terms of emergency, that how it was in the framework of the national political interest, and she talked about that how emergency was providing some kind of a stability and security, integrity and democracy, all of them, they were in danger. So she felt that India's stability, security, integrity and democracy, if they were to be safeguarded, then JP movement was to be in a way crushed, or it was to be silenced. And JP movement was seen to be some kind of a disruptive, or of some kind of a disruptive character. And she talked about the speeches which were given by JP, and she accused the opposition of inciting the armed forces to mutiny and police to rebel. So she in a way tried to justify the imposition of emergency, or the way she functioned at that point of time. And she also communicated that at that point of time the need of the hour was the implementation of the program of rapid economic development, which could in a way provide some sort of a support to the poor and the underprivileged of the society. And she felt that unless India will follow the rapid economic development, then the interests of the various sections of the society, they will not be fulfilled. And this kind of a political scenario which was unfolding in India was some kind of a threat or an obstacle to the economic development of India. And she also talked about that if such kind of political situation will prevail, then intervention and subversion from abroad will also take place, with the aim of weakening and destabilizing India. So when we tend to understand the situation, then we find that neither JP nor Indira Gandhi they chose the democratic way out of the crisis, as has been argued by Bipin Chandra as well. And JP should have demanded, and Indira Gandhi should have offered to hold fresh elections to Lok Sabha, which were in any case due in early 1976. And in October-November 1975, these elections could have been held, and they could have definitely provided a practical alternative to both the demand for her resignation as well as for emergency as well. So we find that this kind of a political impasse which was happening at that point of time in India was not good, from the way democracy was put in danger. And when we tend to understand the kind of limitations, we find that JP movement was also flawed in many aspects, in terms of the composition, its actions and the character and the philosophy of its leader, that how people from different political parties, from different ideologies, they came together on one platform to remove the Congress. This has been talked about by some of the critics of the JP movement. And when one tend to understand JP himself, then JP's integrity was never in doubt. He did not have any kind of ambition for office. He was very fearless, selfless, and he had a lifelong commitment to the civil liberties and the establishment of a just social order. So when one is talking about JP as an individual, so he was renowned for such kind of qualities, and his qualities were never in question at that point of time. But when one tend to understand the way he was talking about those kinds of aspects, from the ideological point of view, he appeared to be vague in nature. And from early 1950s, we find that he became a critic of parliamentary politics and parliamentary democracy, and he tried to popularize the concept of partyless democracy. During 1974-75, he also advocated total revolution or Sampurna Kranti. So we find that from the ideological point of view, there was not much clarity, and JP himself was critical of the parliamentary politics and the parliamentary democracy, and he was talking about a concept or an idea of the partyless democracy, that you have to have a democracy where parties they are not important. And when he was talking about the idea of Sampurna Kranti or total revolution, we find that these ideas, they were not all that clear. They lacked clarity at that point of time, and he was also not able to portray or explain that what kind of a political system without political parties would be established, how it was to be established, what it would involve, and how would the popular will get expressed or implemented in this kind of a scenario where partyless democracy would be initiated. So the idea of popular will, the idea of the masses, that was also not being communicated in his ideas. And we also see that how the socio-economic and political content program or policies of total revolution, it was also not properly defined by him. So there was not clarity in that sense, that what it would involve in terms of implementing it. And we find that how JP himself was a Democrat, and he was not an authoritarian leader, and nor was the movement which he led or initiated in 1974-75, it was in any way authoritarian or fascist in nature, but it was capable of creating a space for its fascist component. As you can see on the screen as well, that how the movement which JP was leading, it was not in any way authoritarian or fascist in nature, but there was some kind of a threat or a danger that the movement which he was leading, then it could create that kind of a space where authoritarianism or fascism could creep into the Indian politics. And his ideas of total revolution and partyless democracy, the way he was talking about them and the way he was criticizing the parliamentary democracy, these ideas were hazy, they were not very clear, they were indistinctive in nature, and they were also they could be dangerous in that sense for Indian democracy, where they were encouraging the cynicism, they were encouraging scorn and despair towards the democratic institutions, and it would in a way create a political climate which was favorable for authoritarianism and fascism. So these were some of the concerns which were raised by the people, those who were critical of the JP movement. And they have also argued in that context that how the way he took the support of the political parties and the groups, how nothing much was common among these groups in terms of the programs or the policies which were to be followed by them, and how many of them they were ideologically incompatible as well. So we find that almost entirely the movement was negative in its approach, and it could not fashion an alternative program or policies except that of overthrowing Indira Gandhi. So we find that the idea of removal of Indira Gandhi became the movement's main goal. So that was the main concern of the JP movement. And the critics, they have also argued that it had a potentially undemocratic character in terms of its demands and methods adopted or planned. So its objective was not blocking off or bringing about changes in particular government policies, but undermining firstly government of Bihar and then at center. So the critics of JP movement, they have tried to understand JP movement from this perspective, they have tried to criticize the undemocratic character of the movement, and they also talk about the various kinds of concepts which were talked about by JP, that how they were in a way not clear. And when he was talking about that how the democratically elected legislatures and the governments were to be dissolved and replaced not through the elections but through extra constitutional mass agitations which were mainly confined to the urban areas. So this amounted to a covert demand for a basic change of political system, that how the earlier political system where democracy was there, that how democratically elected governments they were running the states as well as the central government, and when through agitation, when through strikes, not through the electorate or through the elections, such kind of a change will happen, then it will not be good for the Indian democracy. So this was one idea which was expressed by the people, those who were the critics of the JP movement. We also find that the agitational methods which were adopted and propagated by the JP movement, they were also extra constitutional and undemocratic in nature, as has been argued by Bipin Chandra. And when we tend to understand them in the context in which they were happening, then going far beyond the peaceful processions, demonstrations and the public rallies in Bihar, as it was happening in Gujarat earlier, the tactic was to force the government to resign and the legislatures to be dissolved by gheraoing the government offices, assembly and the governor, and how to paralyze the government and to intimidate and to coerce the individual elected legislatures to resign from the assemblies. So this tactic was to be repeated in June-July 1975 at the central level as well. And another important concern was that how the army, police and the civil services they were being incited to rebel, that how they did not have to listen to the government at the center. And we also find that during the movement, he at different points of time he urged them not to obey the orders that were unjust and beyond call of duty, or illegal and unjust or unconstitutional in nature, or which were against their conscience. So in a way, these kinds of ideas they would prove to be detrimental to the democracy in India, and how the various kinds of decisions with regard to the unconstitutionality and so on of the orders, they were to be made by the individuals themselves, that anything which was considered to be unconstitutional in nature, that the decision was to be made by the individuals themselves. And so critics, they have talked about that these could be seen in the framework of JP's hazy thinking than an actual call for rebellion. And we also find that when you tend to understand JP movement and the climax of the JP movement, it came on 25th June 1975 when a public call was given for a nationwide mass civil disobedience movement which would culminate in a gherao of Prime Minister's residence, thus forcing Indira Gandhi to resign or to enact another Jallianwala Bagh massacre, a massacre she would never be able to live down. So we find that the kind of public call which was given at this point of time, where the mass civil disobedience was to be launched, and how the Prime Minister's residence was to be gheraoed at that point of time, and the Prime Minister would be forced to either resign or to enact another Jallianwala Bagh massacre. So this kind of a situation would not be conducive from the democracy point of view, and Bipin Chandra has in a way argued about this kind of an aspect. And Bipin Chandra has also talked about that how the entire opposition game plan, it was made explicit by Morarji Desai in an interview later in the evening. We intend to overthrow her, to force her to resign for good. Thousands of us will surround her house to prevent her from going out or receive visitors. We will camp there night and day, shouting to her to resign. as you can see on the screen how it has been quoted by Bipin Chandra in his book, and where this kind of an idea with regard to the kind of game plan which was there, and how the opposition plan had all the hallmarks of a coup d'etat as talked about by Bipin Chandra. But thinking apart from such kind of a situation which was happening and the way situation was unfolding because of the conditions by the JP movement, so it was some sort of an insurrection without any kind of a revolution, and the tactics it evolved over time amounted to a kind of a revolution. But this was to be a revolution without a revolutionary party, because there was no party, one party involved, there was no one organization which was involved, and not one ideology, because different ideological people from different ideological positions, they were supporting the JP movement, and so it was to be a revolution to be made with reliance on a mix of ideologically less cadres, that the people, those who are from different ideological positions, they will become part of the JP movement. And we find that how the adoption by a popular movement of a rhetoric of revolution and of extra legal and extra constitutional and often violent agitational methods is not compatible with the functioning of a democratic political system. So in democracy the things were to be in a way talked about, they were to be decided by the masses. So that was the way the things they had to unfold, and we find that when such rhetoric and methods they are not part of a revolutionary design to change the socio-economic order in a fundamental manner. Secondly, when masses enter into a chaotic and disorganized movement without leadership of a properly constituted and led revolutionary party. Thirdly, when faith in a political system is destroyed without creating faith in an alternative system. Resultant possibility is that of establishment of an authoritarian, often fascist regime, or of political chaos, anarchy and disintegration of political entity. So we see that when this kind of a situation was unfolding, and when such kind of a rhetoric and methods they were seen that way, the way they were being utilized at that point of time. So different kinds of situations they were unfolding at that point of time, and there were a number of possibilities as well in the future courts in that particular context. And the opposition could have waited for the Supreme Court for the judgment, and then it could have went against Mrs. Gandhi, and if it went against Mrs. Gandhi, then it should have demanded the implementation of that decision. Then the opposition could also have waited for the general elections to Lok Sabha, which were due in early 1976, and in the meanwhile they could have used the peaceful agitation and propaganda to erode the Mrs. Gandhi's standing among the people. And thirdly, to demand that because Allahabad judgment had eroded Mrs. Gandhi's mandate to rule, fresh elections should have been held immediately in October-November 1975. So we find that the people, those who were in opposition, they wanted to defeat Mrs. Gandhi at hustlings, had won out in October-November 1974, when JP had accepted Mrs. Gandhi's challenge to let next general election decide the fate of his movement's demand. But as we see that how when we tend to understand the politics, in politics 1 year or 6 months, it is a long time, and any popular movement can gain or lose momentum during this particular period, and there was also no guarantee of success in the coming elections, especially as the Congress base in southern India and among the rural poor, women and minorities seemed to be intact. So they wanted to capitalize on the kind of a situation which was there, and when Congress could not get majority in Gujarat elections, so they got some kind of a boost here, and the Allahabad judgment also marked a turning point in this respect, and So they felt that they could bring about that kind of a change which they have been thinking about. And we find that during this period when India, Indira Gandhi did not have much time, and she was also behaving in a very authoritarian manner, and she realized that she would lose her power, and because of which she imposed the emergency through Article 352 of the Constitution, and that was the internal emergency. So how did the emergency come about? What was the legitimacy of the emergency, and what did it mean in the practice, the way it unfolded in practice? Then why was it lifted in the end, and what were the consequences of the emergency? All this will be taken up in the next lecture, when we will talk about the issue of emergency in India. And to wind up or to close the discussion, I would like to suggest that JP movement, the people, those who were associated with the JP movement, they had their own justification, and the critics of the JP movement, they also have their own arguments that how JP movement should have been led, how the idea of JP movement in terms of total revolution, how the idea of JP with regard to partyless democracy, how it will lead to a kind of situation which would be anarchical, it would create an anarchy, and the various kinds of the weaknesses and the shortcomings in the JP movement have also been talked about, and some kind of potential threats, that how it could also pose a situation where the democratic institutions, they will take a beating, that has also been discussed. And in the next lecture we will talk about the idea of emergency and the various kinds of developments which took place in emergency. Till then, thank you very much.